Well, good morning. Goodness, it is hard to believe that we have made it to March already, but that wind outside's definitely saying it is March. So if you're not ready for it, go buy a kite because it's going to be windy for the next month. But we'll make it through, and then thank God for warmer weather because I'm ready. I'm tired of this back and forth stuff that we've had. So, but happy March, everybody. We are so glad to be with you. The fact that it's March is an exciting thing because there's a lot of things getting ready to happen. I'll be honest, I'm glad to be out of February. February was not my favorite month this year. So I am glad to be done with it. I'm glad to be moving on as we head into March. We just announced just a moment ago that we've got our Easter outreach coming up in April. This Saturday, we've got a crew coming out. They're going to help us. We're going to be putting on our new doors. And we're going to be putting in new windows in the sanctuary. So that's happening this Saturday. It's going to be absolutely incredible. So exciting to see that happening. Got a guy coming this afternoon after church to help take out the rest of the baptistry so we can start framing the stage again and getting that ready. So some incredible things are coming up that we're just so excited about. We're kicking off March today with our brand new series, Set Apart. And I'm excited for this. I'm excited for every series we do as we get into it. It's like we get into it and I get excited about the next one. But right now I'm excited about this one as we get ready to start our series Set Apart. And we're going to be talking about how is it that you and I are meant to be in relationship with God. There is a quality, there's a trait that God has shown us about himself. And he says, this is the lens through which you are to know me, through which you are to be in relationship with me. And he says, this is how you are to walk with me. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to begin to dive in and look as we begin to talk about this concept of who God is in our series, Set Apart. And I can't wait to dive into it. Not only that, but March, for Kayla and I, here in just a few weeks, we're going to be celebrating our second wedding anniversary already. And so it's just been a whirlwind of things going on in the last 2 years. And God bless her, she has put up with me for almost 3 years now. And it's just hard to believe that it was almost 3 years ago when she came into my life. And we met in June of 2020. Technically, it was March of 2019, but we'll skip that part of the story. It makes me look bad. So we'll jump forward. June 2020 is when we met. And it was crazy. Our relationship was not the fastest ever, but it was faster than most. But thank God it was covered ahead of time in literally years worth of prayers as we both prayed and waited. And then God, in that season, brought us together very quickly. But we met in June 2020 is when we really began to connect and we began to talk. And then in July of 2020, the very first week of July, I asked her out on our first date. And we actually got a picture from that day that we want to share because, dear goodness, was I sunburned. I spent most of that first date hiding in the shade. That shows my face, but the worst part of that sunburn was on my calves, where the day before I was trying to impress Kayla. They were over at Grandma's. They were burning some stuff. And so I went over there, and I stood at their trash barrel all day poking and burning trash. And then we got the idea to go climb haystack after that. And so we walked up, and during the morning when I'm burning trash, the sun was on the back of my calves. And by the time we got done with that one haystack, the sun was going down. So as we're climbing haystack, the sun was on the back of my calves. And I couldn't even squat down that next day without feeling my calves just burning. But that was our first date, and thank God, red face and all, things went well. She said yes to a second date the next week, and a third date the week after that. And on that third date, we made everything official. I said, hey, would you be my girlfriend? And it was official, and that night it became Facebook official, right? So you knew it was real at that point. And it only took a month from there, and at the end of August, I remember sitting down with Herman and Harriet, and I asked for their permission and said I would like to marry your daughter and got their blessing. And I had tricked Kayla and kicked her out of the house because her birthday was coming up and she thought I couldn't plan her birthday with her around. But that was my excuse to be alone to get her parents' blessing in person. And so she was getting a coffee and I was getting permission to marry her. And so it went well. We both got a win out of that. But then it was only 2 months after that, in October, we got engaged, and then March, we got married in 2021. I think it was about 10 months from meeting to marriage. So it was, again, covered in years worth of prayers to get to that 10 months. But what an incredible journey. But I think back on it, and I begin to think about how that relationship started compared to where it is now. And I remember, like, Caleb's look back at our conversations, and we joke about it a lot because we look back, and when we were first talking, I was still, like, we were super nervous. Like, I never officially asked her out. I don't know if I have yet. But we were in there, we had our first work day, and we were working on the sign out by the road. And her and I were in there painting, and so it was in that moment that I tried to ask her out. I couldn't get the words to come out. She just kind of knew what I was trying to say, so she's like, sure. Right? And so we planned our date without me ever actually asking her out. But we began to go through, and I mean, those first conversations just online, back and forth, and it was like two robots going back and forth, and it was just like, neither of us talked that way, but we wanted to make a good impression, so we were very formal, and we were going back and forth, and then eventually got like a little more personal, where there was friendship being formed, and we were beginning to get to know each other, but it was still like that shallow stuff, right? It's like, what's your favorite color, right? And things like that. What do you like to eat? What did you go to school for? She was working, and so what are you doing? Or what were you doing before COVID? And all these different things we began to learn, and then eventually it grew deeper, and there was deeper conversations that needed to be had. And what is your dreams for the future? What is it you feel like God has called you to? Would you be willing to leave Albuquerque? Because let's be honest, it's not a fair question. Because the reality is I wasn't moving for our relationship. I knew that God had planted me here. And so it was, what does that look like with this dynamic? You're in Albuquerque, I'm here. What would a future together begin to look like? And beginning to have some of those deeper conversations. Things like, what are your hopes in the future for a family and kids? Conversations that sometimes people don't have before they get married and they think they're on the same page. Things we knew that we needed to begin to talk about. And it began to grow deeper. And when we look at things like that, the reality is there's a lot of similarity between how that relationship evolved and how you and I began to grow with God. Right? When we first come to each other, like, nobody's secretive about their favorite color. Right? Alfreda, what's your favorite color? She didn't even hesitate. Purple. You can't just be giving out information of people. Oh, purple. Right now, when they ask for her passcode on her bank in the future, and they say favorite color, I know it's purple. I'm just teasing you. I know you don't have to worry about purple, right? That's a good color. We don't worry about that stuff, but we don't just go up to every stranger on the street and begin to talk about our fears and our mistakes and our past and our greatest regrets. But there's things when we begin an intimate relationship with someone. I remember some of the conversations where I had to open up with Kayla and talk and say, this is what I need you to know about me because this is the baggage that I carry from my past. I was more nervous about those things than any other conversation I'd ever had in the world because she was somebody I cared about. But I knew if I cared about her, I had to be completely open. And we began to have those conversations, and guess what? She stuck around. She didn't run away. When we come to God, we begin to build this relationship, and at first it may be on shallow things, so we're beginning to learn, but over time as we begin to grow, that relationship, for it to go anywhere, it has to go deeper. And it has to begin to grow. But as we talk about having a relationship with God, I mean, it kind of blows my mind. I mean, to think about this, when we think about the very God who created everything, who created the world, He wants to be in relationship with you and I. How do we even begin that relationship? How am I supposed to view the creator of everything? How am I supposed to know Him? How am I supposed to be in relationship? And yet that was God's intention from the very beginning. Here He is, the God who created everything. Who created the very beginning. The God that the Bible tells us is love and grace and mercy, and yet it also tells us that He is just and He will bring judgment. He is the one who made Himself human to die for you and I, to be in relationship with you and I. the one who gives himself to us. How are we supposed to be in relationship with such an incredible, powerful God? And how are we meant to know him? Ultimately, we come into the New Testament, we come into Jesus, who is the clearest understanding of how we're meant to view God. Where Jesus became God himself in the flesh, became just like you and I, so that you and I can know that when we know Jesus, we know the Father. That when we know Jesus, we know who God is. And Jesus became the clearest example for you and I of who God is. And then he gave his life. And he sacrificed himself. The creator of the world, the God who made everything, then became human and allowed himself to be killed, sacrificing all the power he had that you and I could be in a relationship with. And we know as we get closer to Easter, we get ready to celebrate that his death wasn't the end, but that 3 days later he rose because death could not hold the power of our God. And Jesus became this example to us. But God has given us the entire Bible. And the Bible itself is God's way of revealing himself to us. He's given us his word. He says, if you want to know who I am, here it is. And he's literally given us a book all about who he is for us to begin to know. And from the very beginning, God begins to reveal himself. And it starts off in creation. That God is creator of all things. And for hundreds of years, that was God's first introduction to you and I, to humanity. God's first introduction, that first step. What's your favorite color? Who are you? What matters to you? God's first introduction to humanity was that I am the creator. And there's so many things that means: the power, the imagination, the ability. All that tells us about who he was. But that was God's revelation to humanity, that he was the creator of all things. And then God meets with a man named Abraham, and he says, I want to reveal more to you about who I am. He says, so let me tell you. He says, I am powerful. And he says, I need you to know that because I have all power to do all things. And that became the new revelation of who God was. Not only was he the creator, but he was powerful. And he began to show that to Abraham, expecting Abraham to show that to the world, that God was powerful. And he began to show that to Abraham through promises, and through fulfillment, and through doing things that nobody else could do. And then eventually God appeared to a man named Moses. And God said, I'm ready to take you deeper. I want you to know a little bit more about who I am. Because there's more to me that you've yet to learn that I want to begin to share with you. And so he appears to this man named Moses. When he appeared to Abraham before, it was this revelation of his power. It was life-changing. The people, when we read through the Bible, they still didn't exactly know who God was. They were learning. That's why we see this mess in this book of Job, where Job is following God and his friends are following God, and Job believes this about God and his friends believe this, and everything is falling apart because people didn't exactly know who God was yet. But God was revealing himself. He says, I want you to know who I am. It's not a secret. It's not a surprise. He says, I want you to know. And so with Abraham came this revelation of power, but with Moses was going to come a new revelation where God was going to begin to teach people as they began to walk with him en masse for the first time, not just individuals, but an entire nation of people ministering to other nations beginning to follow God with the revelation that God was creator, God was powerful, and God is holy. We're going to begin to understand this view that God gave to Moses, that he is a holy God, as we talk about how do we approach a holy God. How do we begin to walk in relationship? Because it's understanding that he is holy that will impact the way we begin to walk with him, the way we begin to live, the way that we have a relationship with him, and the way that we begin to follow after him. Israel had gone into Egypt during a time of famine. One of Israel's sons had gone down there. He was second in command of Egypt. He was running things when a famine hit. So the family, all of Israel, moved down to Egypt, and they began to live there. And things were going really good for a few years. And then the Pharaoh that was in charge passed away. A new Pharaoh came in, and he didn't like that there was different people living in his country. And so all of a sudden he began to enslave the Israelites. And for 500 years, Israel was in Egypt living as slaves. And then God began to hear their outcry. God began to hear them cry out to him. And God begins to show up, and he says, it's time for me to act. And he appears before a man named Moses. Moses was an Israelite himself. During that time, again, the Pharaoh was enslaving, and all these pharaohs had come against Israel. At this time, the new Pharaoh wanted to kill the Israelite boys to keep them from growing. And so Moses had been placed in a basket in the river as a baby, found by the Pharaoh's daughter. And Moses, as an Israelite boy, got to grow up in Pharaoh's home. And so one day, Moses was out there in the desert. He saw things happening. He saw the abuse of the Israelite people, and he struck out and he killed an Egyptian. He murdered him. And in that moment, he knew what he had done, and so he fled into the desert to hide. And it was there that Moses met a woman. He became a shepherd. He was sheep herding for his father-in-law and taking care of the sheep. And he began to go out one day, and all of a sudden, he sees something that was going to change his life forever. Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. Why the bush does not burn up. Right, Moses is treating this like a tourist attraction, right? You're driving down, and if you go down 40 and you head towards Texas, it's like the world's largest pistachio, right? That's what Moses is treating this like. Like, hey, there's a burning bush over here that doesn't go out. Come check it out. Exit 40 over on the side here. Right? Moses, I'm going to go see this thing because it's weird, it's different. And so I want to see it. And so Moses is looking at this bush, and he's curious. He's like, why is it on fire? What's going on? And then, verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush. Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. See, Moses had known about God. It was his culture. It was his family. It was the way he grew up. That he was the son, the descendant of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who became Israel, from which the nation of Israel came. And so he had known about God. But for the first time in his life, Moses was going to have an encounter with God. Moses knew the power of God. Right, there's a reason it says that the moment that God revealed himself and said, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses' first response was to hide his face because he was afraid to look. Why? Because he knew that if this is the same God of his ancestors, this is a God of power. And he became afraid. But even before God revealed himself to Moses as the God of his ancestors, God revealed to Moses, said, Moses, stop. Don't come any closer. He says, I'm giving you a new revelation, a new understanding of who I am. He says, if you're going to know who I am, you know that I'm powerful. You have no doubts about that. But he said, let me let you know I am holy. Because where I am is holy ground. And it's going to change the way you approach. Right now you're approaching me like a side attraction. Right now you're approaching me like you would the animal at the zoo. Right now you're approaching me like you would the entertainment. Right now you're approaching me like I'm something on the side of the road, but he says I'm not something to be approached so lightly. He says, take off your sandals because where you're standing is holy ground. You need to understand, Moses, that I'm a holy God, and that you can't just approach me any way you want, that you can't just approach me haphazardly, that you can't just approach me like a side attraction, but that you must approach me with reverence and understanding of who I am, not because I'm powerful, but because I'm holy. See, God wasn't there to show his power, to exert power and authority and say, you're going to do what I say because I've got the power to do whatever I want to you. He wasn't there to pick on Moses and to exert his power over Moses. He was there and he's saying, Moses, the reason you're doing this is not because I'm stronger than you, but because I'm holy. And there's respect within that. And you've got to understand, not because of my power, but because of my holiness, there's a new way to approach me. God never told Abraham, take off your sandals because I'm powerful. But with Moses, he said, Moses, take off your sandals because this is holy ground. When we begin to understand the holiness of God, it begins to impact the way that we view our relationship and the way that we begin to approach God. See, for many of us, we understand the power of God. There's a reason why when things begin to fall apart, people run to God and they turn to prayer and they turn to each other. And when things are out of our control, we begin to say, okay, I need prayer now. And we begin to turn to God for prayer because we're expecting God to do something in his power that we can't do on our own. People understand the power of God, but we have forgotten the holiness of God. And it's the holiness that begins to shape how we begin to walk into a deeper relationship with God. We've got to understand the Bible promises that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What God reveals about himself when he's in Genesis as the creator, what God reveals about himself when he speaks to Abraham, what God reveals to himself about Moses, the things that God was is the same who God is. And if God said it about himself then it is true now. And so just as God was the creator, just as God was all-powerful, just as God was holy, he is the creator. He is powerful, and he is still holy. Moses begins to approach, and God says, Moses, take off your sandals, because you're standing on holy ground. The word holy means perfect in goodness and righteousness. But it also means set apart. When God first revealed himself, it was this understanding of power. But as he begins to set the nation of Israel to begin to walk in relationship with him, as he begins to teach people, this is how you get to know me. He says, this is how you grow with me. This is how you get closer. The first revelation he gives to take them to a new relationship with him was an understanding of holiness. And it began with Moses. He said, Moses, the first thing you have to understand is that I am holy. Right? God wants us to know that he alone is holy, that he alone is set apart. There are other gods in this world that cannot compare. There are demons that take on the form of gods in this world that cannot stand up. There are the things that people believe in this world that cannot stand against the one true God. He alone is holy. He alone is set apart. He alone stands at a level that no one else, nothing else in all of creation, nothing in heaven, nothing in earth can ever touch. He alone is holy. But in this, he is also perfect in goodness, perfect in righteousness, perfect in justice. And those things can be so hard for us to understand in moments when we're hurting, in moments when we have questions, in moments when we're doubting. God, why would you allow this to happen? But God's revelation, God's understanding for us is that he is holy, that he is perfect, even when we don't understand, because we live in a broken and imperfect world, that we can trust in His holiness, that we can trust in Him, that He has shown Himself time and time again to be faithful by even becoming human Himself, Jesus, and dying for us, that He will always be there for us, that we can trust that even when things are happening that we don't understand, He is perfect in goodness, perfect in righteousness, because He is holy. And it's understanding God's holiness that is the key to unlocking more of the power and the presence of God in our lives. It is into submitting to God's holiness that we unlock God's glory. Those moments when God's presence begins to manifest around us, those moments where we begin to be in the presence of God and everything begins to change. See, those are the moments we love. To be there where we feel good, where we can feel like God is right there touching us. But the key to embracing those moments, the key to finding those moments is by surrendering to God's holiness. Because it's as we understand His holiness and as we begin to live a holy life that we can begin to enter into the presence and the glory of God. Following the burning bush, God began to speak to Moses, and He said, Moses, this is my revelation to you that I am holy. He said, this is holy ground. And He says, Moses, I'm getting ready to do something. He said, I'm getting ready to release the Israelites and fulfill the promise I gave to your ancestors, to give them a land to call their own. And He says, I want you to be the vessel that I use. I want you to be the tool that does this for me. And so Moses, after giving all of his excuses as to why he's not able to do it, finally gives in. And he goes back to the people that he had run away from so long ago in Egypt. And he first appears before the Israelite people. And he begins to say, this is what God is wanting to do as He shows up to the elders of the Israelites. This is what God is wanting to do. And everybody's excited. Everybody's on board. All right, God's going to do something incredible. Let's see this happen. And then He goes to Pharaoh. And He tells Pharaoh the message of God, let my people go. Pharaoh was much less excited about letting all of his free labor go than they were about being able to not have to be the free labor anymore. And so all of a sudden Pharaoh begins to act out, and for the first time we begin to see what happens when we don't acknowledge the holiness of God. Because Moses would begin to come up and begin to say, God is saying, let my people go. And Pharaoh time and time would say no. And what happens is plagues begin to pour out on the country of Egypt because Pharaoh is not recognizing God. In Egyptian culture, Pharaoh was considered a god himself. And so Pharaoh was pitting himself as God against the one holy God who was set apart. And God began to pour out plagues on Egypt. Every time Pharaoh would say no, then a plague would begin to come. And eventually we begin to see this line drawn. Because God was using this as a teaching moment. And this line was drawn around the Israelite people where they were being set apart. Not because they were perfect, not because they were yet holy. The Israelite people at this point, they were a mess. They had been living in the Egyptian culture for 500 years. They were living much more like the Egyptian culture than they were like a holy culture that God was calling them to. But God was using this as a moment to begin to take them deeper into that relationship to teach them more. And so this illustration begins to take place where the Egyptians begin to experience a plague, and yet this line would be drawn around the Israelite people, where as long as they did what God told them to do, then they would not experience the plagues that were impacting Egypt. And we begin to see this holiness begin to be represented before the people. Eventually the people leave Egypt and the Israelites are taken out and they begin to go, and all of a sudden all these other people already know who God is. They're coming across other nations, and the nations are saying, this is Israel. We saw what their God did to Egypt, and the holiness of God begins to spread out. The holiness of God begins to spread around. And from that moment on, no longer was it just other nations, but now God begins to tell Israel, he says, okay, I've led you back. You've watched me. Now it's your turn to learn about my holiness. And God began to teach not just Moses, but the entire nation of Israel about who he was. And we begin to see it. And it starts off, and God begins to give them 10 commandments. He says, these are my 10 commandments. Begin to follow these. But then he says, oh, and here are 300 other laws for you to follow about how to walk in relationship with me. Well, we've got to understand, God knew they could not follow every single one of those laws. Right? It wasn't about the laws, and it's not about laws today. It's not about the Bible being a checklist of do this and don't do this. It was about understanding the holiness of God was something that you and I could never attain to. That no matter how hard we tried, we could never check off every box to be like God. That's what the laws were about. It was about showing us we cannot do it on our own. And yet God is saying, in my grace, in my mercy, you cannot do it on your own, but I'm going to create a bridge anyways. And he says, these aren't good enough, but I'm going to allow it because I want relationship with you. But with that relationship, there's going to be ways things have to happen because I am still holy. We can't take the grace and the love of God for granted and think that just because God is love and God is forgiving and God is all these incredible things, that I can do what I want and then I can come to God in this way. God began to teach the Israelites. He says, these laws that are showing you can't do it all, but I'm providing a bridge to be in relationship, but you still have to walk in a holy life to serve and be in relationship with a holy God. And they began to lay this out before the people and teach them all these different things that they could begin to walk with them. And ultimately, all of those things are fulfilled through the person of Jesus Christ. But for the first time in human history, there is a map showing people this is how you can begin to walk with God. Before, there was no understanding. They didn't know how to begin to walk with God. But now this holiness was being laid out, and it was the deciding factor in how they walked with God. Over and over, God began to give them instructions. He says, this is how you're to make things. This is how you're to worship me. This is how the sacrifice is to be done. This is how you're to dress. This is what you're to wear. This is how everything is to be done. And it all centered around one thing: holiness. And over, we begin to see this concept where God would tell them, he says, this is what you're to do, and this is how you're to do it. And he says, this is the why you're to do it. He says, be holy, because I am holy. Everything in the Old Testament, all the laws, it pointed to this one thing, that the God we serve is a holy God, that he is set apart, that he's not like anything else, and that when we want to be in relationship with him, then we've got to live a holy life, a life that's going to be set apart. You and I will never be perfect. We're not even going to be close to perfect. The Bible is very descriptive about what our perfectness looks like, and it's not a pretty picture. It compares it to rags a woman would tie around herself at her time of the month. And she would begin to bleed on those rags for that week. And the Bible says that our perfectness, our goodness, that's about as much as it compares to God's holiness. It's a very descriptive picture that no matter how hard we try to be a good person, to do the right thing on our own, it's not enough. But through Jesus, we have access to a new life, a new beginning, and we have access to a holy God when you and I are so imperfect. There's moments we look at Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 6, and his first encounter with God. And when he's first encountering the glory of God, his first revelation was, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips. His first understanding and being the presence of a holy God was, I am unclean. I am unholy. I am far from deserving to be in his presence. And yet so often we forget about the holiness of God, and we take it for granted because we come into church and we can come and we can begin to sing and we can be a part of these moments, and we miss out on understanding that God is a holy God, that there is more to his presence than just singing songs. There's more than just coming to church, but there is a relationship that is deeper and farther than anything we understand. And until we embrace his holiness, we cannot encounter the depths of his glory, the love, and the richness of all that he has. In the world today, in America especially, there are many who believe in God, and they're in church every week. But the question becomes, are we living holy lives? Are our lives being changed? Is the way that we begin to walk and approach and begin to live and serve God changed because of how we understand God? Because for Moses, it began with a moment where God said, stop, take off your sandals because this is holy ground. Before you approach me, Moses, there's got to be reverence. Before you approach me, Moses, there's some things that are going to begin to change. And God took them deeper. Right? There are times that we're going to mess up. We don't always get things right. But God gives grace. God gives mercy as he teaches us to walk deeper in relationship with him. But it begins with understanding holiness. And then the time begins to come that as we understand God's holiness, then God's going to begin to bring correction. Right? God never brings just punishment for punishment's sake without first bringing correction, because his purpose is for us to grow. And so there's times where we may not be held accountable for something that we're doing wrong until all of a sudden we understand that the thing that we're doing is wrong. And once God convicts us of that, then we're held on a new level where God is saying, okay, now you know. How are you going to respond to begin to walk with me? I gave you grace and mercy in a season because we were working on this over here, and I wanted you to understand my power, and I wanted you to understand this about me. But now that you understand this, I want you to learn about my holiness. And now that you know this about my holiness, I want to take you deeper. And Moses first began in a burning bush, and eventually he led the people to encounter not just a burning bush, but a pillar of fire that would begin to lead the people. And eventually it went from a pillar of fire to Moses would go to a tent of meeting where he had embraced the holiness of God by changing so much about his life. This man who had run away, this man who committed murder, had so embraced the holiness of God that he would go into this tent to begin to be in God's presence, to seek after God. And it says that when he left, instead of seeing a fire burning or a pillar burning, it says that his face began to radiate the glory of God so much that the other people couldn't even be around it. And when he would go around them, he would have to put a veil to be in the presence of others. But when he could go into the presence of God, he would take off that veil and he would soak in the glory of God. But it started with a man who decided to embrace the holiness of God. When we embrace God's holiness, we can encounter God's glory. God is trying to reveal things to you and I today. Just as in the course of human history, we begin to look back and we see God begin to reveal himself over time to people. He does the same in our lives. He begins to come and says, this is who I am. Know that I love you. Know that I've given myself for you. Know that I've given my son. For God so loved the world that he gave us his one and only son to save us. Whoever believes in him will live forever. All we're doing there as we declare that worship, as we declare that praise, as we declare that song unto God, is we're just quoting the Bible. John 3:16. And God begins to reveal himself through the person of Jesus, through human history, but he does the same in our lives. And as we grow, God says, all right, this is where you're at. This is what I need you to know now. And as we grow, he says, all right, now I want you to understand this. Each and every one of us here today, God is still revealing himself to us. And he's saying, I want you to know who I am. I want to be in relationship with you. I want to know you. And he says, but for you to walk with me, the one thing you've got to understand is that I am a holy God. I am a God who is set apart. I am a God who is unlike anything in this world. And because I'm unlike anything in this world, if you're going to be in relationship with me, that means you've got to let go of the world. You have got to be set apart as well. You've got to begin to embrace my ways instead of your ways. My ways instead of the ways of the world. My ways instead of the ways that you've done things in the past. He says, I'm a holy God and I love you, but I cannot change my holiness or else I will not be holy. I cannot lower my standard because then I will not be perfectly righteous. I will not be perfectly just. I will not be perfectly good. He says there's a lot of things I will do to make this relationship happen, but there are some things that cannot change. But I've extended a bridge. I've extended a hand. All you've got to do is come. I provided the way. But the key begins with understanding that He's a holy God. Stand with me this morning. We worship this morning with that song, Come to the Altar. It says the Father's arms are opened wide. The altar throughout the Bible is the place where God meets with man. It's also where things go to die and to be sacrificed. The altar played a key part in how people would approach a holy God. And it became that bridge between an unholy people meeting with a holy God. And so today we're going to open the altar, and I want to just encourage you to take some time and begin to allow God to begin to speak to us as we talk about, are there some sandals that we're still wearing? Are there some things in our life where God is there and we can see God moving, and yet we've got things still attached to us that we're carrying with us where God is saying, you've got to lose that so you can walk into the holy ground. You've got to lose that to begin to walk into this holy place. And can we take just a moment to begin to be honest with ourselves and say, God, is there anything that I'm still carrying? For some of us, maybe we don't have to look farther than Facebook. What kind of things are we posting? What kind of jokes are we making? For some of us, what movies are we watching? What shows are we watching? Do they reflect a holy standard of a holy God? For some of us, it may be the music. What are the words that we're listening to? What are they speaking into our soul? For some of us, who are the people we're investing in? What are the things that we're doing when nobody else is around? It's not who we are when we're at church, but who are we when we're on our own? God is always waiting to reveal His presence. He's always looking for the opportunity. He's always ready to invite us deeper, but it begins with a moment of understanding. Take off your sandals, because this is holy ground. Lord, I pray for your people in this moment. As we get ready to open the altars, as we get ready to surrender ourselves, would you allow us to be honest? Would you allow us to face what we've been avoiding? Would you allow us to confront the things in our life, God, that we've been accepting, that you are calling us to remove, so that we can walk into the holy ground of a holy God and walk deeper in relationship, learning more of who you are. As we learn more about you, God, we'll learn even more about ourselves. Prepare us in this moment to step into holy ground.